Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 101 called The Darkest Hour. In the last episode we heard about Heraclius' coup against the tyrant Phocas, but it would be a long time before he could restore the Roman Empire's fortunes, and the first decade of his reign was truly catastrophic. In September 610, as Heraclius' fleet was approaching Constantinople, the Persian general Shahrbaraz, commander-in-chief of the army in Mesopotamia, launched an offensive aimed at capturing Antioch, the second city of the empire after Constantinople. The Roman defences in Syria were weakened by internal division. In Antioch itself, the Chalcedonian clergy opposed Heraclius since they'd supported Phocas in return for his opposition to the Monophysites. Heraclius had to send troops there from Egypt to quell resistance in the city, and the Chalcedonian patriarch of Antioch, Anastasius, was even killed. But it was all to no avail. Shahrbaraz's army crossed the Euphrates near Zenobia, breached the Roman defences and captured Antioch on the 8th of October 610. Although our very limited sources suggest it wasn't brutally sacked, as had been the case when Khosroes took it in Justinian's reign in 540, it was still a monumental blow to the empire. Heraclius had been crowned emperor on the 5th of October, and news reached him of the city's fall only days later. It wasn't a good start to his reign. But worse was to follow. By taking Antioch, Shahrbaraz had effectively split the Roman Empire in two. To his north lay Anatolia and to his south the Levant and Egypt. Panic spread across the Roman Middle East, as evidenced by the many hoards of gold and copper coins discovered in recent times, hidden centuries ago by frightened people as they fled from the Persian advance, never to return. Shahrbaraz consolidated his hold on northern Syria, occupying the whole of the Orontes Valley and taking the towns of Apamea and Emesa. Meanwhile, Roman defences in Armenia also collapsed. This was because of yet more internal divisions among the Romans. Phocas's brother Commentiolus was in charge of the Armenian field army and rebelled against Heraclius, claiming the throne for himself. He evacuated the eastern Armenian frontier and retreated back to Ankara, where he took up winter quarters within striking distance of Constantinople. For the Persian army in Armenia, led by the general Shan, it was an extraordinary stroke of good luck, and his forces surged forward. Commentiolus was preparing to advance on Constantinople when one of his senior generals, Justin, patrician of the Armenians, courageously went into his bedroom in the castle at Ankara and stabbed him to death. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople itself, Heraclius was hoping Khosroes might agree to peace, especially since he'd avenged Maurice's death by killing Phocas, which, after all, was Khosroes' stated war aim. So he rapidly dispatched an embassy to the Persian Shah, replete with generous gifts and a plea for peace between the two great powers of late antiquity. The response was anything but diplomatic. Khosroes reiterated his support for Maurice's supposedly surviving son, the probably fake Theodosius, and said that Heraclius had acted without his authorization in seizing the throne. He then took the outrageous and unprecedented step of beheading the Roman ambassadors. This completely contradicted the history of respectful diplomacy between the two superpowers. Khosroes had crossed an important line that boded ominously for the future. And at about the same time as the Roman ambassadors' heads were severed, there was a disturbing sign of celestial displeasure. In April 611, an earthquake struck Constantinople. The Romans were now convinced they'd offended God and that he was punishing them. In response, Heraclius led a procession to the hebdomon outside the city to offer prayers for God's forgiveness. However, there was little sign God was listening to the emperor's pleas. Within weeks of the earthquake in the spring of 611, the Persians launched a major offensive on the northern section of the eastern front. Their advance was so rapid they seemed to have caught the defenders of the heavily fortified city of Caesarea, that is in Anatolia and not to be confused with Caesarea Maritima in Palestine, unprepared, and they occupied it relatively easily. From there they raided the Cappadocian countryside until the newly appointed general Priscus, who'd taken over from the murdered Commentiolus, counterattacked and blockaded the Persians in Caesarea. The siege lasted for about a year when, in the summer of 612, the Persians sallied out of the city and withdrew back to Armenia. Despite their retreat, the fact they'd escaped was viewed in Constantinople as a failure. Heraclius had hoped to force Shahan's army to surrender, thereby securing a much-needed and morale-boosting victory. He criticised Priscus, who responded by refusing to see him when he visited the front line. Meanwhile, in Syria, the Romans did more than hold their own against the Persians. Heraclius' cousin Nicetas, who'd wrested Egypt from Phocas' control, as we heard in the last episode, defeated them in a battle outside Emesa in the summer of 611. In 613, Heraclius felt confident enough to lead the army into battle in person. This was unprecedented. Not for over 200 years had a Roman emperor taken direct command of troops. Indeed, it had been one of the reasons, in my opinion, for Rome's decline and fall, especially in the West, when the Theodosian emperors had shown extremely poor leadership by entrusting the army to generals like Stilicho. To emphasise his authority, Heraclius dismissed Priscus, who'd been one of Phocas' most trusted generals, rewarded with marriage to Phocas' daughter, and replaced him with his brother Theodore. Heraclius led the Roman army towards Antioch, presumably with the intention of recovering the city that was key to Roman defences on the eastern front. Unfortunately, we have almost no details about the battle that took place close to Antioch. Although Heraclius was defeated, his army wasn't routed and withdrew in good order into Cilicia. Indeed, according to one chronicler, George of Pisidia, Heraclius impressed his soldiers with his decisive leadership and his willingness to endure the hardships and dangers of his men. I actually think this is propaganda written after the event. Heraclius' defeat outside Antioch was in fact catastrophic. It opened up the entire Middle East to Persian invasion. So why wasn't there more internal opposition to Heraclius, who was clearly failing to win the war? I suggest the answer lies with the desperate situation the empire was in. There was simply no alternative to Heraclius. The Eastern Front had all but collapsed, and attention was on survival, not on retribution against the emperor, who in all fairness was doing everything he could. And the Eastern Front was now on the very verge of collapse. Heraclius could do nothing to stop the Persian advance. They extended their territory either side of Antioch, advancing north into Cilicia, which is in modern Turkey, and south to Damascus, which they occupied apparently without a significant fight. This opened the path to an event which would be viewed in the ancient world as second only to the sack of Rome by the Goths in AD 410, the Persian sack of Jerusalem. But, to begin with, it wasn't clear whether the Persians even wanted to occupy Jerusalem, let alone sack it. In early 614, the Persian general Shahrbaraz led his army south into Palestine and occupied Caesarea Maritima. The Roman army, led by Heraclius' cousin Nicetas, didn't oppose him, presumably because they regarded the Persian army as too large to fight. Shahrbaraz seems initially to have been unsure whether to occupy Palestine. Instead, his army based itself in Caesarea and sent delegations to the adjoining Roman towns, offering them peace if they submitted to Persian authority. There was no request for tribute and no show of force. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, Zacharias, seized on this as a generous offer and allowed a small Persian garrison to enter the city. At first, all was calm and the unusual agreement seemed to be working, but not surprisingly, tensions were high among the frightened Christian population of the city, and during the Easter celebration, which fell on the 30th of March in 614, the blue and green factions, always eager to have a fight, turned on the Jewish population, claiming they'd welcomed the Persians into the city. Rioting followed, and Jews were rounded up and executed. The Blues and Greens then attacked the small Persian garrison, which presumably fled, although its fate hasn't been recorded. This was enough for Shabaraz to march his army to Jerusalem and lay siege to it in April. Our sources don't agree on the details of what happened next, but the siege seems to have lasted about 3 weeks before the Persians breached the walls, having mined underneath them, and caused their collapse by the Damascus Gate on the northeast side of the city.
We'll be back after a quick break.
When it comes to, therapy or counselors, I'm a pastor. I do counseling. But my counseling is based upon the Word of God. And although there are expertise that often extend beyond what the Bible teaches, as long as it doesn't contradict the Word of God, it can be extremely, extremely helpful in your life.
Jerusalem was then subjected to a brutal sack. Quite how brutal, again, varies between the sources, which range from 17,000 to 90,000 of its inhabitants killed. The sources say nuns in particular and many other women were raped. The chaos and carnage lasted for 3 days, after which the Persians tried to restore order by dividing the inhabitants into 3 groups. First, the Jews, second, the Christians who were allowed to stay, and third, the Christians to be deported. Those deported included the city leaders and those with useful trades. The Patriarch Zacharias was among the deportees and apparently did a good job in raising their spirits as they were marched into Persia to settle near to Ctesiphon. Fortunately for them, Khosroes' Christian wife is then said to have intervened to protect them. Somewhat surprisingly, the Persians weren't interested in occupying Jerusalem and effectively gave it to the Jewish population and then withdrew. The Jews were allowed to round up and execute those Christians who'd started the pogrom in the Easter celebrations, and they were even allowed to reoccupy the Temple Mount, the site of Herod's temple, which the Romans had destroyed over 500 years before and left as a derelict site. The fall of Jerusalem shook the Roman world to its core. All the Roman chroniclers recorded their despair. The anonymous author of the Paschal Chronicle said, quote, "We suffered a calamity which deserves unceasing lamentations." In Constantinople, to boost morale, a new chant was introduced into the liturgy of Hagia Sophia, asking for God's protection. Elsewhere, the fall of Jerusalem was seen as a decisive sign of Roman weakness and encouraged the Avars, Slavs and Lombards to consider more serious invasions of the empire. It was indeed a dark hour for the Romans, and the loss of territory, people, and most importantly, tax revenues, meant Heraclius was faced with a financial crisis. We have no means of measuring just how bad this was, but we know that early in 615, probably in Lent, when public attention was focused on austerity, Heraclius announced that imperial salaries would be halved. This time there was no outcry such as would have happened in the Emperor Maurice's reign, no attempt to overthrow him, as Heraclius happened to Maurice. Instead, civil servants and soldiers meekly accepted the decision, knowing there was no alternative. Heraclius introduced a new currency, the hexagram, a crudely stamped silver coin weighing 6.8 grams, instead of the usual gold coins, the so-called solidi, to serve as a way of using untapped stocks of silver bullion, but also softening the psychological blow of a pay cut by providing civil servants and soldiers with more coins than they would have received with the smaller number of gold ones. The inscription on the coins read, Deus adjuta Romanis, may God help the Romans, reminding people of the gravity of the situation. With Heraclius struggling to respond to the financial crisis, the Persians struck again. This time, Khosroes directed an offensive against the imperial capital itself. The Persian general Shan, in command of the northern armies, made a surprise dash across Anatolia, avoiding the Roman army guarding the Taurus mountain range and probably using Roman military roads. Unopposed, he rapidly reached Chalcedon on the opposite side of the Bosphorus from Constantinople. Historians have never known what his objectives were, for since he had no supporting fleet, there was no possibility he could cross the Bosphorus and attack Constantinople itself. His intention might have been simply to distract Heraclius from Egypt, which was Khosroes' next main target, or it might have been simply to display Persian power and to foment unrest against Heraclius himself. Whatever the true reasons were, the sight of Persian soldiers across the Bosphorus convinced Heraclius that he had to plead for peace. He began by sending presents to Shan and his men, even cash payments, including the new silver hexagram coins, which the Persians liked since they were used to a silver-denominated currency. Roman officers were instructed to offer their Persian counterparts invitations to feasts as a goodwill gesture. This was the precursor to the main event, which involved Heraclius himself crossing the Bosphorus and meeting Shan in the harbour of Chalcedon. Heraclius stayed aboard his boat, surrounded by members of the Senate. Other boats filled with soldiers were drawn up alongside in case the Persians tried to seize him in a surprise attack. Messengers travelled between the two and conveyed Heraclius's peace proposal. And we have an excellent record of this peace offer from the anonymous author of the Paschal Chronicle. And the key point is that it shows the utterly desperate situation the Romans were in. To begin with, the request was made not by Heraclius, but by the Senate. This was because Khosroes wouldn't even recognize Heraclius as the legitimate emperor. Since he continued to make his claim, he wanted to place Maurice's eldest son, Theodosius, on the throne. So if the peace offer had come directly from Heraclius, the likelihood was that he wouldn't even have acknowledged it. The Senate went so far as to apologize for appointing Heraclius emperor without the Shah's approval. They blamed extraneous circumstances, i.e. the civil war with Phocas, and highlighted that once he'd been overthrown, an embassy had been dispatched forthwith to Ctesiphon. To avoid antagonizing Khosroes, they didn't mention that he had beheaded the unfortunate and entirely innocent Roman ambassadors. So desperately did the Romans want peace, the Senate even said Heraclius would become the Shah's servant, quote, eager to perform the service of your serenity, i.e. Khosroes, in all things. They were, in effect, offering to be the Persians' vassals. It was a complete Roman capitulation. In the harbour of Chalcedon, where the messengers were communicating this peace offer, the Persian general Shan said he could only alert Khosroes to the Roman entreaty, since he had no authority to respond himself. Heraclius and his delegation withdrew back to the city. Our sources are limited, but it seems the Roman general Philippicus, who was now the senior general on the Eastern Front, and his army had been following Shahan's lightning raid on Chalcedon and were now closing in on the Persians. Not wanting to be cut off, Shahan retreated back into the Anatolian interior. Heraclius and the Senate were no doubt worried this would be the end of negotiations with Khosroes. In haste, they prepared a senatorial delegation to travel to Ctesiphon to emphasize the peace offer. 3 brave men stood forward to make the expedition in the full knowledge that the last Roman ambassadors had been beheaded. Leontius, the prefect of Constantinople, Olympius, the praetorian prefect, and Anastasius, the patriarch's assistant, set off on the road for the Persian capital. The document containing the peace offer made it clear they should be treated with respect. Quote, "We beseech that our ambassadors be received in an appropriate manner by your superabundant majesty, and that they be allowed to return to us." End quote. In other words, please don't chop their heads off as you did with the last ones. We have no record of their reception at the Persian court, nor of their deliberations with Khosroes, if indeed there were any. The Romans were willing to give him pretty much everything he wanted. He probably could have insisted on deposing Heraclius and replacing him with his fake puppet Theodosius. He could probably have demanded much more territory and tribute from the Romans. He could have secured the most prestigious agreement with Rome in the entire history of the 2 superpowers of antiquity. But he didn't do any of these things. He didn't even make a formal reply to the Senate's offer. The months passed and there was simply no reply. We know that the 3 brave senators who made the trip were not executed, or at least not straight away. They were all sent to jails where they were held indefinitely, but none of them ever saw Constantinople again. Leontius would die of natural causes before the last war of antiquity was over. A grimmer fate awaited his 2 colleagues, Olympius and Anastasius, in the final months of the conflict, shortly after Heraclius had crushingly defeated the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in 627. They were both led out and crucified. It was a cruel fate for such brave men, and especially so close to the end of the war and Roman victory. One of the greatest mysteries of the last war of antiquity is why Khosroes chose to reject this Roman peace offer, an offer that would have been so advantageous to him. We have no records that enlighten us about his thought process. We can only assume that he thought Rome's last hour had come, and that he could now obliterate it completely. Some historians believe he was inspired by the memory of the Persian Achaemenid Empire and wanted to restore its vast domain stretching from India to Egypt and Greece. But there is no actual evidence of this. For Heraclius and the Roman Senate, it was their darkest hour. It reminds me of the dilemma Winston Churchill faced in the summer of 1940 when the German army had crushingly defeated France. Many in Britain wanted to offer Hitler peace, but Churchill refused, vowing to fight on the beaches and never surrender. Unlike Churchill, Heraclius was all too willing to surrender, something which Edward Gibbon could never forgive him for. But it was Khosroes who turned him down, and in so doing the Persian Shah made a terrible mistake, for he'd underestimated Heraclius. The Roman emperor would now rise to the challenge and achieve the impossible. It would be a long war, and Roman victory was still years away, but it was Heraclius who would turn the tables on Persia and win one of the most extraordinary victories not just in Roman, but in world history. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time on the 14th of December, and we'll continue with the story of Heraclius and the last war of antiquity. And if you like the podcast, please do leave a review and join my mailing list on my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, where you'll find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.